Good morning and welcome back to the Shanty. It's a beautiful sunny day here in the Shanty. It's supposed to be 80. So now you know that I'm actually recording this today because yesterday it was chillier. And what I was hoping to do today, and the reason I put it off as long as I did, was I was hoping what we could talk about today was the recommendations from the governor's return to the office work group, which I thought first were coming out last week and then were coming out this week, and it's now Tuesday and still not a peep from the governor's work group. And watch, I'll say that, and then in half an hour they'll come out with some recommendations. Unfortunately, I haven't done that yet, so but I do want to put a program out, and I don't want to wait for them. So we're going to do this little Shanty episode on other considerations for remote work as we get out of the pandemic. Let me promise you this, when the work from home work group gives us some recommendations, when they come out with their first set of recommendations, no matter what day it is, we won't wait for the next Tuesday. We'll get a Shanty episode out to talk about what they're recommending. So with that in mind, let's talk a minute, and this will be a short one, but let's talk a minute about what we're going to do when we get to the backside of this pandemic, when it's all over, and hopefully that will be someday very, very soon, and we're back to what quote-unquote normal, and people are starting to come back to work, whether or not we're going to change the way we do remote work. General Motors, in an article in one of the Detroit papers, I can't remember which one it was, has already come out and said, hey, we're going to have a different way of working post-pandemic. We're not going to have people in the office every day all the time. We're going to allow more freedom and more remote work. They're going to do things like hoteling desks, and you might not even have an office or a dedicated workspace and stuff like that, and you can go find the article if you want to read about it. Lots of companies are thinking about that. How are we going to do that? And that's great, because I'm thinking about that. Am I going to stay in the law shanty, or am I going back to the office? And when I go back to the office, how often am I going to go back to the office? Those are all things that we're all thinking about. It's easy for me here in the shanty, because the shanty is in Michigan, and my office is in Michigan. That's not necessarily the case for everybody. So I want to talk about some of those issues. We're not going to get into a lot of depth, but I just want to point out to you some of those issues that you need to think about. Because we've heard talk, and we've talked about it too, about what does this do for recruiting. I can now recruit from a much bigger pool of lawyers if I'm a law firm, because I don't necessarily need everybody physically in my office. Some lawyers can work remotely without too much trouble at all. Depending on the kind of work they do and where they do it. So big New York firms, for example, big Chicago firms are now thinking, hey, I might not need all this really, really expensive real estate in downtown Manhattan. I can have people work from their apartments, their homes, from West Virginia. So what does that mean? If we're going to do that, if we start hiring people now specifically to work remotely, what does that mean, and what are the issues we need to think about? And I want to talk about some of those issues, just a few of them. There's probably more than this. We could probably talk about things like privacy and security and stuff like that. But that's not what I want to get into. What I want to get into is some of the more concrete legal issues that you might have to deal with. If you've got an employee who is not in the state where your business is, because we now want to hire them. So the first thing I want you to think about when you're doing that is, if you're in Michigan and your employee is in, let's use California. California, what do I have to think about with that employee sitting in California? Well, issue number one, especially when we're talking about a state like California, is wage hour issues. Don't forget, not only do you have, in most states, federal wage hour issues, minimum wage, overtime, meal breaks, rest breaks, stuff like that. Minimum wage is probably not a big issue for you, but it might be. But meal breaks and rest breaks and stuff like that, not only do you have federal requirements for those issues, but you also have state requirements. And if you've got an employee sitting in California, you've got to follow California state law. with respect to things like meal breaks. And in California, meal breaks are mandatory. And in California, overtime is daily. And so those are issues you need to think about. So when you put people in another state, I want you to remember that you've got wage hour issues. Not only do you have state wage hour issues now, but some cities have minimum wages, $15 an hour minimum wage. I think San Francisco has one now. So think about that. The second thing that I want you to be cautious of and be aware of is the issue of workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. So you've got workers' comp in Michigan, no problem. You've got unemployment in Michigan, you pay into the fund in all likelihood, no problem. It's a tax on your payroll, no problem. What about if you have an employee sitting in Tennessee? Do you have to have workers' compensation in Tennessee? Do you have to pay into the unemployment fund in Tennessee if you now have a worker sitting in Tennessee? The answer to those questions is probably yes. Now, there might be some minimum employee requirements before you have to have it, but those are things you want to think about. And by the way, you want workers' comp anyway. You want that protection. So again, when you start placing people in different states, don't just think you can put them there and call it good and we're done. We've got to think about workers' compensation and getting that set up, and we've got to think about unemployment and getting that set up. The third thing I want you to think about is related to that, and that's taxes. Okay, now we're talking about withholding taxes. And in most states, an employee pays tax. It's a physical presence rule. If the employee is physically present in the state, they have to pay taxes in the state. Some states, the law is different. And remote workers might be subject to income tax in 2 states. I don't think that's the case in Michigan. I'm not a tax lawyer, but I don't think that's the case in Michigan. But it's an issue that I want you to be aware of, and I want you to talk to your tax people about, your accountant or your tax lawyer about. Okay? The next thing I want you to think about is more it's a how are we going to handle policy issue. Okay? For most states. But then again, we've got California. And that's leave laws. What leave might be available to an employee who works in a different state? You've got the FMLA. But don't forget, if you've got an employee sitting out all by themselves in a different state and they're not within 75 miles of 49 other employees, they're not technically eligible for the FMLA. Are you going to make them eligible for the FMLA? And even if you're not, is there a state leave law that you have to comply with? In California, there's a gazillion of them. There are other states that have leave laws. Most don't, but many do. So something to think about. Also, you have to think about the issue of vacation and how vacation is earned. In some states, there's a requirement that vacation be accrued and not, awarded like we can do here in Michigan. So how are you going to give vacation? And is it going to differ from your normal policy? So those are some of the things that I want you to start to consider as you start to consider how we're going to do remote work going forward. It's just a little checklist for you. There's probably a few more things we should be thinking about. Like I said, like privacy concerns and discrimination issues and training issues and things like that. Depending on what state you're in, do you have an obligation to do those things? But that's basically kind of the checklist that I want you to keep in mind. So as you're thinking about hiring at the end of the pandemic, and hey, we've got this great candidate sitting in Louisiana, but they don't want to come work for us. Think about these issues before you just go and pull the trigger. Now, that's not a reason for you not to pull the trigger. You may very well want to hire that person in Louisiana, and we live in a new world now. But if you're going to do that, make sure you're properly set up so that you don't run into any legal trouble down the road. Again, thanks for joining us today. That's my little checklist. Hopefully we'll hear something from the state remote work task force or back to the office task force or whatever the heck the name of it is. I know a lot of you are looking for it. Hopefully we'll get that in the next couple of days. And if we do, again, I'll get a Shanty episode out and we'll take care of that. If you want to talk about remote work, give us a call. Otherwise, thanks, and we'll see you next time.